Think of a difficult moment you've had with another person. If I asked you to tell me the story, how would you describe it? And what do you think would change if I asked the other person to tell me the story? My guess is they'd probably be different stories that make you each believe something unique about yourselves, your circumstances, and the experience itself. The funny thing is, you would both say that your story is the truth. But the reality is, neither of you would be wholly right or wholly wrong because you're both just telling your story. Here's the thing. Our brains are wired to tell stories. And the stories we tell ourselves and each other help us make meaning of who we are and the world around us. And those stories can either empower and inspire us, or they can keep us stuck in really unhelpful patterns. So today, I want to bring you along with me as I reflect on the power of our narratives. Together, we'll work through an exercise designed to help us examine and rewrite the unhelpful ones we have. That's all coming up right after this short break. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and the world around us. A few months ago, I sat down with someone who's thought a lot about storytelling and making meaning. His name is David Kessler. Now, David is one of the world's foremost experts on grief, which, by the way, is not just about death. He says it's about any change that you didn't want. And his interest in grief emerged in the wake of a series of really traumatic experiences in his own life. When he was 13, he witnessed one of America's first mass shootings while his mother was dying in a hospital across the street. And David would go on to work with the pioneering psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Together, they authored On Death and Dying, where they discussed the 5 stages of grief that you've probably heard of and are widely known: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But a few decades into his career, everything changed for David when his son unexpectedly died. The profound grief that he experienced shook his understanding of these 5 stages, and he knew there had to be something beyond acceptance. To David, he eventually came to that something being meaning.
Acceptance was almost thought of as this end point. And I don't believe in closure. Elizabeth didn't believe in closure around grief. And so, in my own experiences, I was like, there has to be more. And that's when I thought about, after acceptance, there's much more to be found. And I think that's the meaning.
David says that the story you tell yourself repeatedly becomes your meaning. And research backs this up. Studies show that storytelling is actually a key ingredient in how we make meaning. And researchers have studied how people tell their life stories. And they found that we naturally include the key ingredients of a story. We divide our experiences up into chapters that are defined by dramatic highs and lows, and we highlight the conflict and lessons throughout the story. And not only are we translating our experiences into stories, these narratives we create impact how we view ourselves. There is a whole field, actually, of psychology devoted to understanding this connection, and it's called narrative psychology. And here's a quote I love from Dan McAdams, who's a leader in the field. He says, "We are storytellers, and we are the stories we tell." And that's the key. We shape our narratives, and our narratives shape us. We mine meaning from what happened to us, and then we use those stories to help us navigate the world and understand ourselves and create beliefs. The problem is that the stories we write about our lives are not very factual. David writes that we often create stories to protect ourselves or to avoid pain. But what if those stories are faulty and not serving us? What if they fail to tell the whole story?
It's interesting to think of how we say things. No, I don't want to date anymore. I just can't put myself out there. Oh, there's some fear there. Mm-hmm. There's some fear of rejection. I can't take any more abandonment. And I think one of the things that happens in grief is we believe, oh my gosh, this is the rest of my life. I'm going to be in this pain the rest of my life. Or some of us have horrible things happen and we shut down and we go into fear. And here's the thing I want people to know. Fear doesn't stop death. Fear stops life.
This is why when David works with people who are grieving, a large part of that work is examining the stories we tell about our most painful experiences. And he encourages us to identify where in those stories we are looking for meaning. Because we're here, I want to ask you how you define meaning.
I think, when I was writing and researching meaning, the biggest misconception is people go, there's no meaning in a horrible divorce. There's no meaning in a murder. There's no meaning in a drug overdose and the terrible things in our world and shootings. And I think how I realized is that meaning isn't in those horrible events. Meaning's in us. It's what do we do after? What do we do after these horrific events? Not just what do we do, but who do we become? And, I think everything can change us, and we have some agency in how things change us.
And to get back that agency, we have to question the accuracy of our stories and separate fact from the tough emotions like regret or guilt. And when we do this, David says we can turn that regret and guilt into understanding and meaning. So how do we actually start to do this? Well, in David's newest book, Finding Meaning, the 6-Stage of Grief workbook, he offers a ton of powerful exercises for working with our stories. And we're going to sit down and do one of those exercises together right after the break. While we're away, grab a piece of paper or go to the notes section of your phone, and I want you to list 3 major events that you want to look at more deeply. We'll be back in just a few moments. Okay, so before we dive into this exercise, I want to set the scene and talk about how we know we're ready to do this. One of the core tenets of David's work is that before we can move through a difficult experience, we have to excavate that pain. And he often says you can't heal what you don't feel. So before we try to examine and break apart our stories, we have to be aware of how we feel and accept it. In David's book, he shares some research that illustrates the immense power of this, which comes from the work of social psychologist James Pennebaker. He understood that people who experience a traumatic event are more likely to be depressed, emotionally volatile, and die of cancer or heart disease than those who had not experienced a similar event. I know that sounds scary, but research had also found that those who kept their trauma a secret had a significantly higher rate of death. This made James wonder if this meant that sharing secrets improves our health outcomes. And what he found is that people didn't have to share their secrets with someone else to benefit. They just had to write them down. People who wrote down their stories and their secrets had lower rates of blood pressure, lower heart rates, and fewer feelings of anxiety and depression. I share that to highlight the power of simply writing and examining our stories. And that's what we're going to do today. So if you're ready, here's an exercise David recommends. It's called Separating Fact from Story. And David first heard about this from his friend, the author Neil Strauss. First, you're going to list those 3 major life events that I asked you to think about. And I want you to list them just as facts, with no emotional spin or story attached to them. In the second step, he tells each of those 3 stories in the worst way possible. So you're only focusing on the negative parts of those experiences. And in the third step, we're going to tell these 3 stories in the most positive way. What were the smallest good outcomes of each of these experiences? Did you grow or improve? Did they make you more compassionate? David notes that whenever he does this exercise with a group, afterwards he asks why they think he had them do it. And people always say that it's to point out that there's good and bad in everything, or to realize that there are more than one way to see things. And while these are all true, he says they're not the goal of the exercise. Instead, the goal is simply to increase our awareness of the way in which we tell our stories. Here's what he writes. What's important to remember from this exercise is that the facts of the events do not change. How you tell your story is what makes the difference. You are not the author of the facts, but you are the author of how these stories get told. That's where you have some control. Okay, I'm going to walk you through this exercise and share some of my stories. And I'm going to start with sharing just the factual versions of those 3 major life events. Number 1, when I was 14, my parents got divorced. Number 2, in 2022, I launched a podcast. Number 3, in the last few years, I have experienced the loss of 2 important friendships. Now, what is the worst way I could tell these stories? For number 1, my parents' divorce, it'd sound something like this. When I was 14 years old, my parents got divorced. It was unexpected and it was really hard. I felt like my family was broken. My dad moved out, and I worried we would never have the opportunity to become close again. Here's a worse version of number 2. In 2022, I launched a podcast publicly. I was so nervous to write or share anything. I was incredibly scared to be publicly criticized, and any criticism I saw felt like a personal attack or proof that maybe I wasn't good enough. Now, the third story. In the last few years, I've experienced the loss of 2 important friendships. It's been really confusing, and I've experienced a mix of emotions: denial, anger, and I've been sad. I've missed my friends, and I've ruminated on what happened. And in the absence of understanding, I've filled in the gaps, sometimes blaming myself or thinking that I'm a bad or flawed person. Sometimes I blame them, and I also spent time worrying about what they thought of me and what they told other people about me. It's been a really tough experience that I haven't known how to navigate. All right, we're getting personal here. So let me flip the script, and I'm going to tell you the best possible way to tell these same 3 stories. Number 1, when I was 14 years old, my parents got divorced. It was really hard, but because of the arrangement they made, I got to stay in the house that I grew up in for the rest of high school, which meant I didn't have to completely shake up my life. And because my dad moved out of the house, we started to have a more intentional relationship. By the time I was in college, we had built something incredibly close that still continues today. Number 2, in 2022, I launched a podcast publicly. I became a podcaster. It was scary, but I've become much more confident with writing and sharing. I've also gained a thicker skin when it comes to criticism, and I have a new understanding that my work will be for some people and not for other people, because we can't all be for everyone. I'm also building my tolerance for discomfort, and I've seen that the positives of doing this work outweigh any negative comments. I get to feel like I'm making a really positive impact with my work, and I feel like I'm in my purpose. Number 3, in the last few years, I've experienced the loss of 2 important friendships. It's been really hard, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand, process, and figure out what happened. But over time, the voices of blame and guilt and shame have dulled, and I've grown from what happened. I've learned a lot about compassion. I found compassion for myself and for the other people in the situation. I think of them really fondly now. And the experience has also made me more intentional about my community, taking time to cherish the people who are closest to me and intentionally tightening my circle of friends and family. And something else really interesting happened. At the time that I experienced this loss, other friendships that had previously faded came back into my life. So this experience also helped me understand that what's happening right now may not be the permanent situation. Okay, so after taking the time to walk through these different versions of your stories, take a little space to write about how it felt. Here are 4 more questions that David asks, so if you're journaling, I recommend spending time on each of these. Number 1, if I could use my power as I move toward healing, I would. Number 2, what are some areas in your life where you feel powerful right now? Number 3, what are areas in your life where you would like to feel more powerful right now? And number 4, my favorite, what could you do to feel more powerful in your life right now? I know for me, doing this exercise has given me clarity on these big moments in my life. I can see all these little pieces of my stories that have gotten tangled up in a narrative and how most of them were negative. I've also realized how these stories have changed over the years. If you'd asked me to tell you these stories when they were happening, they'd be very different. Even if you'd asked me a couple months ago, they'd be different. And I think it's something we all realize, but to notice that so clearly helps me feel less attached to any specific narrative in my life. But the biggest thing I notice when I do this exercise is how much easier it is for me to write the negative version. I often think of myself as a really optimistic person, and I want to focus on resilience and positivity, but my brain finds it so much easier to slip into pessimism and fear. And when I'm not taking care of myself, that fear can come out really easily. All that being said, I love in this exercise being able to see the positive and being able to clearly see that it's actually not toxic positivity. The positive things I listed are real. The negative things I listed are also real. For me, doing this exercise highlights how my tendency toward the negative is just a habit, not a reality. But like we heard David say earlier, fear doesn't stop the bad things. Fear stops us from living. And I don't really want to be guided by fear. I want to be guided by optimism. Thank you so much for joining me for this exploration. If you want to go deeper into this, especially if you're working through any kind of grief, I highly recommend you check out David's workbook. In it, he has other exercises that help you work through your stories. One of my other favorites is writing your story from the perspective of someone else. I'd recommend you try that one out next, and we've put links in the show notes to David's books and his online resources. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Grace Rubin and Emily Reeves. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. Tim Boland mixed our show. We get additional support from Alex Kuznetsova. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Koop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief and vice president of content development at LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and we'll see you next week.